Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear us here in London. We're still waiting for a few people to join us, so we're going to just leave it a couple of minutes just to give people time to get their logins working. But please bear with us for a few moments. So good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll get going on this. I'm delighted to be introducing the Council of Deans of Health's first webinar session on the Advanced Clinical Practitioner Higher Degree Apprenticeship. We're delighted to have Pat Hibbard and Katrina McLean here with us today to talk through the apprenticeship standard and the HE Multi-Professional Advanced Clinical Practice Framework for England, which is due to be launched soon. The way we're going to work the session is that Pat will provide an overview of the standard and the EPA, and then Katrina will introduce the framework afterwards. What we're going to do is ask participants if you would like to submit your questions using the question function. We will pick those up as we go along, and after the presentation we will go through those questions and answer them as best as we can. So I'll pass over to Pat to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Graham. Good afternoon, everybody. So we approached Graham about this webinar to give really people the opportunity to know where we are in the process. I think when we met in London a few months ago, we agreed that we'd try to make the process as transparent as we could. We are still in the middle of the process of developing particularly the endpoint assessment. So today there's probably, we can only give you an outline, but it's hopefully enough for you to be starting to think about with your employer partners, you know, how you might be approaching delivery of the apprenticeship. But as I say, it's still fairly fluid at the moment. So for those of you who, bear with us, bit of technology issue here. So for those of you not familiar with apprenticeships, I thought we'd give a bit of a background to them, and I suppose share some of our learning that we've had as part of the journey. So one of the key things about apprenticeships is that they are employer-led. And so they lead the development of the apprenticeship to meet their skill needs. And so for Katrina and I that have been HI advisors on the Trailblazer group, that's really what our role is. We are not there to develop the standard, that's an employer-led activity, but we're there to advise in terms of the endpoint assessment and for a degree apprenticeship, how that's going to fit in and the level of it being relevant for master's level. So apprenticeships are standalone, unique occupations which require substantial training of at least 1 year. And that's a really important point because it means that the apprenticeship must be a minimum of 12 months. And so any apprenticeship that's related to ACP must be a minimum of 12 months, and that will appear as part of the apprenticeship programme. And it's also a standalone occupation. And I think one of the key things is to not see apprenticeships as a CPD, apprenticeships are for an occupation and a role that is being defined by the standard. Again, that's one of the things I think we've learned as we've been going through. And they apprentices must be in employment, which clearly is relevant for ACP, and they will sign an apprenticeship agreement with their employer before coming on and before starting the apprenticeship, and they must include a minimum of 20% off the job learning. So the Trailblazer group was formed with a whole range of employers that were representative across England, and they were responsible for developing the standard, and the Trailblazer group is also responsible for developing the endpoint assessment plan, but that activity is delegated to a subgroup who works on the endpoint assessment plan and presents that back to the Trailblazer group for approval before it can be submitted as part of the standard to the Institute of Apprenticeships. And myself and Katrina have obviously been on the endpoint assessment subgroup. We've chaired that, and we've had other representatives from other universities and also from dentistry, and we've had some feedback from medicine, etc. into that. But it's a small subgroup, and we chose HEI representatives carefully so that we were trying to represent the different, geographically different parts of the country, but also different types of programs. For example, the difference between our program, which is the multidisciplinary framework in West Midlands, and another program which is online, so that there was a variety of types of programs represented. But it's really important that you understand that the HEI representation is advisory for the Trailblazer group. So there was a full consultation completed. I'm sure many of you were party to that and gave your feedback at that point. And then the standard was approved, was submitted to the Institute of Apprenticeships, and was approved in October 17, subject to a number of conditions that the IOA have identified. Those conditions have been dealt with by the Trailblazer group, and that's being resubmitted. So that's where that is in the journey. But the apprenticeship cannot be approved for delivery until endpoint assessment is also approved by the Institute of Apprenticeships. So we aim for the endpoint assessment to be submitted to the IOA at the end of next month, end of November 17. But obviously that's at the beginning of its journey, and it could be a few months or period of time before that is also approved. So one of the first questions that we had to ask was whether this apprenticeship would be non-integrated or integrated. For a degree apprenticeship, it's, I suppose, recommended that the apprenticeship is integrated, which means that the endpoint assessment is actually counted as part of the total credits in the degree. So it's a part of the degree as opposed to separate to the degree. In a non-integrated, then obviously the apprentice would do the entire degree, and then they would take the endpoint assessment, having already got the degree, the title of the degree, and then the assessment is separate. So the Trailblazer group were keen that this would be part of gaining the full master's degree. So in this Advanced Clinical Practitioner apprenticeship, the EPA will form part of the degree, and that has a number of implications. The HEI that awards the master's degree is normally the endpoint assessment organisation as well, and therefore will need to be on the register of apprentice assessment organisations. So subject to the Institute of Apprenticeships approval, the EPA for the Masters in Advanced Clinical Practitioner Apprenticeship will form the final 20 credits of the master's degree. I think we've talked about the subgroup membership, but yes, we had a small number of HIs involved, as I've said, based on Trailblazer membership, geographical representation, types of courses. And we also had some employer representation on the subgroup as well. So there are a number of challenges when writing endpoint assessments that I think we've learnt over the last few months. And one of the key things is that the endpoint assessment must measure the overall knowledge, skills and behaviours of the ACP apprenticeship standard. So at least one of the endpoint assessments has to be, or one of the methods has to be synoptic and cover the apprenticeship standard. The endpoint assessment is taken at the end of the apprenticeship, after all the what they call on-programme learning has been completed, and the gateway requirements, so what will be stipulated in the endpoint assessment programme guidance is the gateway requirements that need to have been met. So all on-programme learning must have been completed, and the gateway requirements set by the endpoint assessment will need to have been met. And the achievement in the EPA, in the endpoint assessment, decides the grade that is awarded to the apprenticeship. It doesn't decide the overall degree classification, because that's awarded by the university, but the actual apprenticeship, the endpoint assessment has grades attached to it, and though that in that 20 credits, the actual grade that will be awarded for the separate apprenticeship will be decided. So we've talked about the synoptic assessment. So it's quite a challenge, obviously, to measure all of the standard of advanced clinical practice, the 4 pillars, the 4 areas, I should say, of the apprenticeship. And we have to do that through a minimum of 2 methods of assessment. I think one of the key things that is governing our thinking around endpoint assessment is also that it can't cost more than 20% of the total cost of the apprenticeship, and costs obviously still being calculated. But that does restrict, for example, the amount of things like observed practice that you could have as endpoint assessment methods. So because of the cost of doing that, and also the nature of the standard, it might make that difficult to do. The length of the endpoint assessment has to be proportional to the apprenticeship, and it has to demonstrate independence from on-programme learning and assessment throughout. And what that means is when we write the endpoint assessment, we have to make sure that the methods and the mechanisms used ensure that the university running this, which is also counted as the endpoint assessment organisation, has an independent process for assessment in that section, which does not involve the people who've been involved in delivering what they call the on-programme, so the rest of the master's programme. Those people cannot be involved in the endpoint assessment. It has to be an independent process from the on-programme assessment. So all of those factors and features have to be written into the endpoint assessment plan. I'll say a little bit more about what our thinking is around the endpoint assessment shortly, but just for those of you that are thinking about this and the way forward with this, the endpoint assessment organisation is referred to in that way, but for integrated degree apprenticeships, it would normally be the university. It would be the university that is delivering the apprenticeship. So the responsibilities of the endpoint assessment organisation is that they will implement the endpoint assessment plan, which is written and has methodology and instructions and guidance and criteria all written into it, and that has to be delivered, or the commitment to delivering that has to be taken by the Endpoint assessment organisation. Although universities are, obviously normally autonomous in this, from the point of view of that, the last bit of the apprenticeship, everybody has to adhere to the same format and structure, and that it comes out in a detailed guide. So you have to adhere to any specific arrangements or additional criteria that's set out. You have to quality assure the endpoint assessment in the same way that you quality assure. There will be a process for quality assurance written in, but obviously everybody is familiar with quality assurance processes. They have to record the EPA achievement and also adhere to any external quality assurance requirements in the plan. So in terms of where we are with the assessment, the endpoint assessment at the moment, it's not yet, as I say, it's not going to be submitted for its first go really till the end of November. But we've been working very collaboratively and hard and getting feedback on our thinking to date. So it is having feedback from our advisors as we go along. So where we think we're going with this is that we will have two methods of assessment included in the endpoint assessment. And at the moment, and I can't give you any more detail about this because it hasn't been submitted, so it could all change. But at the moment, we are thinking that the two methods will be an examination and a presentation of practice. And I don't really want to say an awful lot more about that because we could be telling you things that then don't get approved or whatever, but that's roughly where we're up to with it. In terms of the registering as the apprentice assessment organisation, clearly we will all need to demonstrate we've got relevant occupational experience of the standard, and I think that's slightly different to when you register as a provider of assessments, because obviously you have to be registered. The university has to be registered as a provider. It's a separate register, and the university is registered. But my understanding for endpoint assessment is that it's done at an occupational level for the assessment organisation, because obviously we have to have the ability to assess that particular occupation. I think importantly, in terms of your delivery times, or all of our delivery times, we can't actually apply the standard and the EPA until they're approved. Now, when the standard is finally approved by the IOA, that will actually go up on the gov.uk website as a standard. But the whole programme is not approved for delivery until the EPA is also published. So there's a little bit of a time lag to go yet in terms of people being able to get approved for this, but it may be that you want to start thinking in your organisations or talking to your universities about you wanting to register to deliver this. And as I've said, you can't deliver, if you're an endpoint assessment organisation, the apprentice assessment organisations cannot deliver the learning elements to the apprentice and that to the same apprentice, and that means you have to keep a separate process for the endpoint assessment. And the other regulation is that you can't use the EPA to people who are not apprentices, so that would have an impact on your programs. Your programs for apprentices are going to look slightly different, or going to look different in structure to your programs for your people coming through on other routes. So the ACP apprenticeship, as far as, and this again is all subject to approval and conditions, etc. But in the standard, it's been agreed that the ACP apprenticeship is a full master's award of 180 credits. It will normally be delivered over a 36-month period, but very importantly, the minimum period is 12 months. And that is really important if people are thinking about things like APAL, etc., that there has to be a minimum period for the apprenticeship of at least 12 months. The on-programme learning and assessment, subject to approval for the endpoint assessment, will be 160 credits, with 20 credits attributed at the end of the programme to the endpoint assessment. And that obviously might have implications, or will have implications for people in the final part of their advanced clinical practice programme. Really importantly, these programmes are employer-led, and so the endpoint assessment does not have any governance over what you do in that 160 credits. The on-programme learning and assessment is absolutely up to the assessment provider, the apprenticeship provider, to agree and to deliver in partnership with and in line of the employer's needs and requirements. So 160 credits is provided that that 160 credits clearly meets the apprenticeship standard as published, is locally decided to meet employers' requirements. It is only the final 20 credits of the EPA, well, 20 credits as we're provisionally agreeing, if subject to conditions, will be attributed to the EPA, and that is the element that is actually prescribed in terms of what you have to do and what's in that. There will also be gateway requirements identified for the, which is stipulated, will be stipulated in the endpoint assessment plan when it comes out. So those are currently, and there may be some additional ones to this related to the actual assessment methods of the endpoint assessment, but we haven't. Those are obviously subject to approval. So they must have proof of current registration with their particular statutory health and social care regulator. So that's another check on registration. The next one is common to all apprenticeships. So at the end of, at the point of a gateway requirement, all apprentices must have achievement of an English and Maths qualification at a minimum of level 2. And whilst this does not necessarily seem relevant at this stage to advanced clinical practitioners working at this level and doing master's degrees, you will need to check that your apprentices have got a minimum of a level 2 English and Maths qualification, and if not, that will need to form part of the apprenticeship. So that is not an ACP requirement, that is a general apprenticeship requirement. On programme learning assessment, they will need to have successfully, provided that it's confirmed that 20 credits will form the EPA, the on-programme learning and assessment will, they'll need to have successfully achieved 160 credits. And the confirmation from the employer is that they have achieved the knowledge, skills and behaviours in the ACP apprenticeship standard within the workplace. So there's two elements going on there. There's something about the university confirming that the 160 credits have been successfully achieved at Gateway, and then there's confirmation from the employer that the requirements have been met within the workplace. And also the final bit is the apprentice's employer will confirm that they consider the apprentice ready to progress to the endpoint assessment at this point. And you know, that might be for a whole number of reasons that they may perhaps hold them back a bit or put them forward, but they actually confirm their readiness to progress. I've talked about the independence from the programme. The endpoint assessment organisation also will develop the detailed endpoint assessment materials in line with the plan. So In the EPA plan, there will be an outline of each method's activity and what's expected and what it must assess and the criteria against which it must be assessed. But the assessment organisation will be responsible for example, setting an examination question to test the standard, or for providing further information regarding the presentation. So the endpoint assessment, they develop the detail for the apprentices obviously in more depth to give guidance, but that must be based on what's written in the endpoint assessment plan. And then also the endpoint assessment organisation or the university will be responsible for recruiting and training independent assessors who will meet the criteria to conduct the EPA. So we would say, for example, one of the areas we might have as an example of that to put in is that the independent assessor will need to have occupational competence around ACP. And they must undertake, obviously, we will outline, or we have to outline in the EPA plan, the internal and external QA processes to guarantee independence and to ensure consistency against the standard. And those independent assessors that have been appointed will be responsible for assessing the final grades awarded at that are outlined in the EPA. So it is the independent assessor that actually awards the grade of the apprenticeship. And obviously this is an extra cost to universities. The EPA can't cost more than 20% of the total cost of the degree. So that obviously limits, we have to work within those constraints and writing the EPA. But when we're costing the EPA, we're obviously costing in the cost of appointing an independent assessor into the apprenticeship tariff. So in conjunction with this process is the development of the costs that will be proposed to the IOA, because the costs are agreed at a national level as to what this master's degree apprenticeship will cost. So we are considering, when we're developing the EPA, we also have to consider what the costs of that EPA will be, and that goes in as part of the proposal on the tariff. As I've said, the assessment organisation has to align to the internal QA process that's set down in the EPA. It might be slightly different to the normal university's internal QA process, but when committing to the apprenticeship, you have to commit to the processes that are outlined by the apprenticeship standard and the EPA. So that's part of that commitment, is recognising that sometimes there will be it will be done slightly differently to how you would normally do that. Obviously, university regulations cover the whole. The EPA does form part of the whole degree, and the university regulations will form part of the whole master's degree. And it will have the external scrutiny, which you would also expect for any accredited degree. So at the moment, the external QA process will be the Institute of Apprenticeships, because this is a degree standard. There are obviously different arrangements for apprenticeships that are sub-degree standard, but at the moment, the IOA is the currently proposed external QA provider. I'm going to hand you over now to Katrina to talk about the HEE multi-professional framework, and then we'll both take questions at the end.
If I may also just say, if you'd like to start submitting any questions you do have now, that will give us a chance to sort through them all and we can respond to them.
That's great. So please feel free to start submitting your questions. We'll do our best to answer them. I think it's important to say that we're not experts. We've learned a little bit more by being involved in the process, and we're doing our best to try and share what we know. But we will do our best to answer what we can.
Thank you very much, Pat. That's a really useful overview. I think one of the questions that's going to be raised by about the Advanced Clinical Practitioner Apprenticeship is how it bears in relationship to the work that many of you will know that Health Education England has been doing in relation to advanced clinical practice. And I've had the pleasure of being involved in both groups, so I've kind of straddled both pieces of work, and thought it might be useful just to provide an update on the Health Education England work, and what's coming up and the forthcoming event on the 16th of November. Just to talk about the Health Education England work, it's been going on now for the last 2 years, and many of you will have seen that a product so far has been the definition, and I think it's fair to say that it's a multi-professional framework, so that right from the start it was being viewed as being open to all different professionals, from both health and social care. And what a key sort of principle has been building on existing work that's been done both across the other countries of the UK, but also in international work, etc. as well. In terms of operation, there's been a steering group and a working group. I've been part of the working group, and the former chair of the Association of Advanced Practice Educators, Ruth Pearce, has been on the steering group, and the representation within the groups has been quite wide, and as different organisations, etc., have expressed an interest to be involved, those groups have expanded accordingly. The overall aim has been to recognise that there is widespread inconsistency and lack of cohesion in relation to advanced practice, as all of the attendees to this webinar will know. But one of the goals has been to achieve a consensus, and in this case an England-wide consensus, in relation to what we mean by advanced clinical practice. The term clinical was specifically used to recognise that there are public protection challenges and accountability challenges related to advanced practice. And some of you might have been aware, for example, of a study that Alison Leary and myself and colleagues published recently, which identified the use of advanced practice being used as a term for people who are not even regulated health professionals, in some cases band 3 and band 4 health professionals. So the whole widespread use of the term advanced practice at all levels has become a real challenge. One of the goal outputs of the framework, therefore, has been to establish a definition and then associated framework in relation to that. And the definition was published, and I think probably I'm imagining that a lot of people tuning in today are from HEI providers, but one of the challenges was the use of the description master's level ward or equivalent. And what does that mean, for example, in relation to education for advanced practice? So, since the publication of the definition, which is available on the HE website, we've been working very hard on looking at other aspects of the framework. Initially, what was described as the core capabilities, and these have been described under 4 pillars, which many of you will recognise are 4 pillars that have been used in other country work. So we have the clinical pillar, leadership and management, education and research, and that also echoes the 4 categories that are used in the apprenticeship standards, so there's this sort of read across there. And the capabilities have been developed and refined, particularly in the light of a lot of feedback about different aspects of advanced practice in relation to social care, not necessarily a direct clinical focus. How could that be encompassed? How can we make sure we're fully reflecting not just nursing but all the allied health professions, etc. as well? So the core capabilities have been developed, and we also have been looking at other aspects that needed to be produced in a framework that could then be published for everyone to use in the many areas where people are looking for guidance and clarity. The launch event on the Thursday, the 16th of November at the Kia Oval, London, is going to be where the first part of the framework will be really launched. in the sense of a framework that will then be populated with a toolkit, and the toolkit will have further and additional resources online. In deciding what needed to be published in the framework, we've gone for 3 principal areas. One is about planning the workforce and governance, another's about accountability, and the third one in relation to education and development. And we have been looking at what principles could be published in the framework and then further developed in relation to the toolkit. So I know many people wanted to get to the event on Thursday the 16th of November, but in fact the actual online version of this framework will be released before then, so that people have a time to review that. And actually on the actual official event, there's 300 delegates are going to be able to attend. We will be looking at not just what the framework says, but also in groups in workshop format in the afternoon, looking at these 3 areas and further developing and refining those, very much with the delegates' participation and involvement. I think it's just fair to say in relation to the apprenticeship that for me, in my mind, I've kind of understood these 2 pieces of work, that the framework is really describing the level of practice. This is the level of practice that should transcend all advanced practice activity across England, whatever the title of the particular health profession, health professional, and it forms in that sense a benchmarking opportunity for advanced practice. I think it also recognises the many settings, many ways in which people are working, and this is, as I said, the sort of the strand, the common strand across. The advanced clinical practitioner is a sort of sub-activity in relation to a new role and a new occupation and a new area. But we have been mindful in both groups of the respective activity, and we've kind of used them as reference points. So it could be viewed as confusing, but hopefully it will be viewed as an opportunity in 2 different ways to really look at how advanced practice is being taken forward. And I'm sure your questions will pick up on these points, but hopefully that was a useful summary of where we are.
Thank you very much. So we've already been receiving questions. I'm going to pass these over to colleagues who will answer them and just work through them. And so bear with us, we'll do our best to get through all of the questions that you've asked us.
Okay, thank you, Graham. So the first question that we've been asked is around the level 2 qualifications in English and Maths. And the question was whether there was, I think at the meeting in London a few months ago, there was talk of GCSE, and whether there was flexibility and these could be other level 2 qualifications. As far as I was aware, there was flexibility, because I think the apprenticeship requirement is level 2 qualifications, but we can certainly clarify and confirm that. There's nothing specifically written.
No, I think that's fair to say. I think it is in relation to level 2 qualifications, and certainly there are some organisations and some online packages that are available to support that process. That the achievement of that level 2 would need to be by the time they get to the gateway. So there's a significant amount of time for people if they were in a position that they needed to demonstrate that.
I think we've had a question in about the validation process for this because of the external quality arrangements with the Institute, with the proposal of the Institute of Apprenticeships. And is it mandatory to have the IOA present? As far as we're aware, no. It's not that type of external quality assurance. I think the quality assurance would be that there would be, at some point, a review of what the university was doing, but they don't have to be there at the validation event. Again, this is my best knowledge, and you know, I'm sure this will come out in a more confirmed way. But as far as I'm aware, no, I think we haven't had any other information about that. Yes, an interesting question. Somebody's asked, will the usually final stage of a master's is the dissertation. would it be expected that this component reduces to allow for the 20 credit EPA? We've had a lot of discussion about this, as you can imagine, but yes, for the apprenticeship, whatever your final component is, it might be dissertation, whatever you have as a final component or a component in that last 60 credit, whatever you're doing, 20 credits of your final stage of your programme will be saved for the EPA. So the EPA will not dictate what you do before then, but that final stage will be, so if it is a dissertation you do, then you might have to relook at the dissertation, but yes, it will form part of the degree credits and it has to take place at the end. So whatever you do at the end of your Masters is probably the area you're going to have to revise.
And just to add to that, I think that may, I suppose, end up being a 40 credit dissertational project, for example, or it may be re-looking at that third year completely. And I know, for example, University of Salford and Cardiff University have kind of looked in quite an innovative way in relation to their third year of their advanced practice and made it more clinical than it might traditionally be. So I think it does give an opportunity to re-look at that, but obviously for some universities that might be a challenging mindset in terms of approach. But when we've looked at our university, which is London South Bank University, there's nothing in our regulations stating that we need to have a dissertation. What's more important from them is that we meet the SEEK Masters descriptors, for example. I think the other point also just to add is that in the apprenticeship you cannot have over credit. So, for example, it's not opportunity to provide more than 180 credits in your Masters. So that again may have implications, for example, for how much credit is used in a dissertation, but also may have considerations in relation to the prescribing course, for example. Currently at our university, our students do the prescribing course and we use only 20 credits in their actual Master's programme, so we're going to have to redesign our course to use the full 40 credits of the non-medical prescribing within the programme. So I think it is very much about working out how you maximise the use of your credit, but also for universities is going to be a way of rethinking a Master's programme. But in terms of economy of scale, I think the other thing I've certainly learned from reflecting through this process is that we're uncertain how many students, how many apprentices we potentially will get. So we're certainly thinking about designing a one course that both apprentices and non-apprentices can do versus having an apprenticeship route and a non-apprenticeship route because of economies of scale, etc.
I mean, I think as you started to think about design of programmes, it's really important to just to remind you that at this point none of this is approved, and it is our proposal that it's 20 credits, but that may not be what it finally ends up as. One of the key principles we have to work to is that the endpoint assessment is proportional in terms of length, and so that's what we work to really, is just what feels proportional in terms of that last assessment period or that endpoint assessment, and also in terms of the amount of time spent on it, because we thought what's a proportional amount of time for endpoint assessment. So we've been sort of discussing around the three to, we haven't finally confirmed that, and that's why we haven't talked about it. We're probably talking about 3 to 4 months, something like that, for the final assessment. But as I say, really we're just sharing where we're up to with it, and we just a reminder to say that isn't what's finally approved yet. So we'll wait to see what that is. The next question, to clarify, can the HEI be the provider of both the Masters and the endpoint assessment, accepting these results will be undertaken by 2 separate teams within the HEI? And the answer to that is yes, because the endpoint assessment organisation is obviously going to, because it's integrated, it will form, the APA is going to form part of the accredited degree of the university. So I think it's accepted that they would be one and the same, but as the person who asked the question is absolutely right, the key point is how you can demonstrate your processes for independence from the on-programme learning, and that's going to be the key element. The appointing of independent assessors who are not, who have not had any involvement in the on-programme learning assessment, that you can demonstrate independence.
And just another sort of practical idea we have within that is that we can see models where, maybe not reciprocally with a local university, but where other universities could potentially act as the endpoint assessor for your students, and vice versa. Obviously, we don't want it to be sort of too reciprocal, but essentially within the networks, we can use the networks and the content networks to provide that for your students. I think some of the challenges is going to be resourcing that, so we would anticipate again that you would use networks to think about how to resource that and enable you to provide the endpoint assessment wherever, according to the numbers of students involved.
So often exit routes. So the next question, apologies, is that often exit routes are given so that students can leave with a PG Cert or PG Dip. Would there be any option for an ACP apprentice to leave the apprenticeship route and exit with just a PG Cert and PG Dip? The criteria is that whatever that programme, whatever that exit is, it must have been at least 12 months, because that is the minimum time for an apprenticeship. I think the apprenticeship, as far as I'm aware, is paid on a monthly basis. Is that right?
Yeah.
So it is possible for them to leave the apprenticeship, but they won't gain the apprenticeship. They'll just gain an award of the university. If they were employed by their employer to undertake the apprenticeship, they won't have fulfilled the employer's requirements for the apprenticeship, so there may be implications there. But in terms of credits gained, they will have been on they will be entitled to 60 credits or whatever as an individual, but they won't have achieved the apprenticeship if they exit early. So the next question is, does the HEI have to be on the register of approved assessment organisations in order to run an MSc for apprentice advanced practice? It's kind of a converse question to the other one, and I don't really know the answer to. I guess the query is whether you can appoint someone else to be your endpoint assessment organisation. I don't fully know the answer to that, but I would think that would be about whether the validating university would be, whether that would be an arrangement that they would. Is that right?
Yes, but I think you do need to be registered as an apprenticeship provider.
You have to be, yes, you have to be registered as an apprenticeship provider.
And your universities may already be registered, and hopefully there will be an apprenticeship team that you can speak to identify what the position is on that. But the endpoint assessment registration will happen as a separate activity, because as Pat said, it's a subject-specific kind of approval. And again, it would be worth making links with the apprenticeship teams now to find out what the process might be and how they can support you with that process. From experience, again, I'm finding that there are colleagues within the School of Health and Social Care who are involved in apprenticeships, but it's that sort of the higher level understanding and process guidance that you can get from the apprenticeship team within the centre at university.
Absolutely, but in terms of what I've picked up from the process is that you will probably be both the provider and the assessment organisation. We've got to the level 2 maths English entry criteria. I think we've answered this. Is presumably this would be all equivalent as it is for other programmes. It's not an entry criteria, it's a gateway criteria. So it's at the point of the endpoint assessment that they have to have met level 2 maths and English. I think it's just defined as level 2, not communication. Please confirm whether the proposal is for an integrated EPA and the independent assessors can be HI staff who are not involved in the delivery of the programme. Yes, the proposal is for an integrated endpoint assessment, so it is an integrated degree apprenticeship. In terms of independent assessors, they will have to have occupational competence. They cannot have been involved in the on-programme learning and assessment, and it's going back, as I say, to how the organisation can demonstrate independence in the assessment process.
And most of us, I think, were thinking that we haven't got the luxury of having people who have occupational competence within our school who aren't involved in the programme. Most of us wouldn't have that choice. Anyone with that kind of experience is probably involved in delivery and assessment for the programme, which is where we might look to other universities or independent individuals who you could then buy in to perform that role. And that's something we've had to think about in the costings of the endpoint assessment, is that independence and that occupational knowledge and experience. Almost like some people might buy in OSCE examiners and things like that. It's almost that, you're bringing people in for their objectivity and their skills and knowledge, but they have that objectivity in that they haven't been involved in the programme. Yes, we're just coming up to, where are we? How do you propose the external examiner will be involved in quality assurance of the EPA? Again, that's a really, really interesting point, because again, in our discussions, some of them have been about what happens on the on-programme aspect and what happens at the endpoint assessment. And of course, this relates to a university providing this, so they will want to see that kind of external oversight. At the moment, what we're thinking is that the on-programme course, the 160 credits, will of course have an external examiner as normal, who'll be involved in the quality assurance of those 160 credits. But we also felt, or suggesting, that in the endpoint assessment, the external examiner will have a role in sampling and reviewing the aspects of what's confirmed in the endpoint assessment, so that the university can be assured that, again, standards are being maintained in terms of university regulations and processes. So in that sense, the external examiner will have a bit of a dual role, is our current thinking at the moment, in terms of external oversight and scrutiny.
So the next question is, in terms of delivery, can apprentices learn with non-apprentices, however, then have their EPA in terms of the final 20 credits, whereas non-apprentices have a separate assessment? I think from our point of view, we are not, the endpoint assessment will not dictate anything that you do in on-programme learning and assessment, and clearly, provided that the programme that employers are commissioning and working in partnership with them meets the apprenticeship standard as approved by the IOA and as will appear on gov.uk. The endpoint assessment is only for apprentices. It's written for apprentice routes. So obviously what you do on the local level then with other routes in your programme is a matter for your university.
And I suppose, again, I've been mapping this out over the last couple of weeks and thinking about potential options, and again, wanting to try and use economy of scale and not have completely two separate pathways. Was thinking that what we might do is the non-apprentices might use the opportunity, for example, of using option credit or some kind of speciality module or some kind of opportunity for them to do some other form of learning that is of equivalent size in terms of credits as the endpoint assessment. And so that's what we're currently thinking at the moment, you know, thinking along the lines of whether it could be mentorship or, as I said, some kind of clinical module or something equivalent. So I think it's a good question, and again, it's about whether we go for two different pathways or the same pathway, which has different endpoint activities, for want of a better word. One might be the endpoint assessment, and for non-apprentices there might be something else for them to do, but they can't both join the endpoint assessment.
There's a question about, are there any plans to make this recordable, registrable qualification in professional bodies? Not that we're aware of. As you'll be aware, again, I'm sure there are many groups that are looking at apprenticeship as a way of looking to provide, you know, utilise this funding model, and certainly not aware of any professional body suggestion or regulatory body suggestion that will go into this. The rules and the governance about apprenticeships are determined by the governance, by the apprenticeship standard and the endpoint assessment activities, and that's really the governance around it. I think what will be interesting is that there's much more onus on the employer to be involved in the support of the apprentices within their work-based learning, and their monitoring and review as we go along. So in some senses the apprenticeship may tighten up some of that employer support and ongoing development as they progress through, which hopefully will help enhance some of the learning aspects as well. Okay, if a student had personal difficulties and health issues on an apprenticeship route, would they be able to take an interruption to study as they can at present and then return to study after a period of off? Again, the on-programme learning, the actual main body of part of the apprenticeship, which will be the 160 credits, not given to the EPA. Your regulation, your normal, you know, support absolutely would apply equally in the endpoint assessment. If there were issues, then, you know, it would be important to ensure that equality and diversity was met, and that, you know, students had the same access, or should say apprentices had the same access to, you know, time out if they need it. I think the important thing there with apprenticeships is it is an on-the-job program. They are employed and they are on a kind of an apprenticeship employment type contract, and therefore there has to be a close liaison with the employer around this. And as I said, one of the aspects of the gateway requirements will be that the employer gives, you know, identifies that they're happy that the apprentice is ready to undertake the endpoint assessment plan. So clearly, if somebody was having some, you know, problems, they might sort of say, well, don't do that, don't trigger that process right now. But yes, I think the normal, as far as my understanding is that the normal processes would apply.
Yes, so the next question is, do you see it linking to the RCN credentialing to gain status? I think it's fair to say that this is a separate activity in relation to the requirements for an apprenticeship for the advanced clinical practitioner. The standard has been written generically in following consultation, and was tweaked and adapted to try and make it appropriate for a range of health and social care professionals. But alongside that may well run other credentialing activities, for example, whether it's the Royal College of Emergency Medicine requirements, etc. So it's not an either or, but it will be up to employers to determine whether there's other standards and other aspects that they'll want as part of that. I suppose that's probably as much to say to that, really. You know, as other quality markers are developed, then I can see a university using, you know, obviously not just applying for apprenticeship, but possibly others as well at the same time, or as an alongside event. But at the moment, I think there'll be quite a bit of work just meeting the apprenticeship requirements. For HEIs who use credit volumes of 15 and 30 credits, will there be flexibility in the credit volume assigned to the EPA? Our group has certainly discussed that at length, and we're very aware that different universities have different approaches, and it's in no way trying to be obstructive. But ultimately, the EPA is set as the national standard. You can't have an either or, for maybe some of the reasons that you've heard us discussing today, because we have to set not only what the assessments are, but these are activities that the students will need to do independently. So we can't sort of do a 30 credit version and a 20 credit version because of the lack of consistency, and this has to be a consistent standard that applies wherever you are in the England setup. So we just had to be pragmatic and say we realise it may cause courses to have to think about 5s or 10s or whatever. But again, hopefully having a heads up, such as we're discussing today, might help to think about that. And again, you know, I think in terms of the university, it's saying, you know, if you're wanting to, as a university, be involved in apprenticeships, there will be some implications for our courses as a sort of knock-on effect. And maybe we're having to be aware that, you know, that this is the driver that's causing us to rethink in some cases in terms of approaches.
The next question is, could it be possible that the EPA could be assessment of practice or OSCE type assessment for the examination part of the assessment? I think it's fair to say that would be unlikely. It's not obviously we haven't gone through approval yet. And the reason that would be unlikely at this point is because we have to keep the costs proportional to the within the 20%. And once you start looking at the practical form of assessment, like OSCE, or and it has to be generic enough, obviously, to cover the very wide variety of professionals that will, you know, may undertake an apprenticeship in advanced clinical practice. Then it's deciding what sort of practical assessment that would be, but at the moment that's unlikely to be that type of assessment.
The next one is, what will the entry requirements for applicants to the apprenticeship be, and will they match our HEI entry requirements? Essentially, the standard for apprenticeship, it's not in its remit to determine what the entry requirements for the actual master's programme will be. It is likely, I think, that most HEIs will continue to have very similar to what they've got now. But again, and this is kind of, I suppose, the ideology behind apprentices, it's up to the employer to determine that with the HEI. And they will negotiate that together. And of course, in employers selecting who they want to be apprenticeships, they may have additional aspects that they want to consider in addition to any that the HEI have got. So it's going to be about collaboration with the employer and making sure that you're maximising the chances of success and maximising the return on investment for the particular individuals. But there's nothing that says what an apprenticeship needs to have at the beginning for an advanced clinical practitioner degree. What's much more important is the gateway, and it's understanding that the gateway at the end of the period of study of 160 credits is the point that then will determine going on to the endpoint assessment. So there is kind of a new language around this and a new understanding about this. But I think from my knowledge through API of many of the HEI programs, you know, many programs are in a very good place in relation to these aspects already, and nothing's going to sort of override that in terms of entry requirements at the moment. So for example, if some HEIs like our own have that you don't have to necessarily have a full degree to enter a master's program, nothing in the apprenticeship standard is going to say that you can no longer do that. Yeah. Oh, one for me. Sorry, me again. If we cannot attend the event on the 16th of November about the framework, will there be opportunity to provide feedback to inform the principals and toolkit? The framework, as I said, is going to come out online, and really the formal event on the 16th is kind of a launch event. But yes, there will be opportunities to contribute. I think all of us who've been involved in the framework so far have certainly tried to feed in any aspects that have been brought to our attention hopefully people would be able to be aware of that. Or if you did try and register on the Eventbrite, you might well have had the contact person from HEE who you could feed your thoughts and ideas into. I think if we, as in terms of developing the framework, we kind of recognise that things aren't going to be perfect, but there is such an uncertainty and a variability at the moment that people needed something to refer to and to begin to build and use. I don't think it will override local frameworks and good practice that's going on. Hopefully it will reinforce it and take it further forward. But I think people felt they needed something from which to sort of build, and hopefully that will come out. And certainly if any of you have got really good examples of good practice under whether it's workforce governance, accountability or education development, I think it's certainly worth sharing that through ourselves or other contacts you have within the group, so that we can publicise those on the toolkit website. And the toolkit's likely to be populated over the next sort of year or so. So as people come across things, then it's making people aware so that we're not all reinventing the wheel. That would be really useful.
So the next question is, do you have any employers committed? We have concerns about lack of employer engagement, use lack of funds to create a new post, usually at a higher band, and backfill for when APs are engaged with learning, and how can we overcome this challenge? I think that, I mean, obviously the Trailblazer group aren't part of, they don't do an implementation stage, they write the standard, get the standard to approval and obviously ready and to the point of delivery, but then that's very much a local level decision around, the commitment to employers to this. Obviously there's been a wide range of employers represented on the Trailblazer group who are, committed to developing a standard in this area. But I think that's a local level discussion really with your employers about how they see their organisation design, whether they want these posts, and if they currently how they currently fund their ATPs through at the moment. Again, whether funding models will change once the apprenticeship standard is because it depends whether they get their funding currently for ACP development. So I think there are a number of kind of things that might influence that, but I think in terms of keep engaging with employers to tell them what you know about the apprenticeship, and what's one of the reasons we thought it would be useful to do this afternoon was to start giving people a bit of a heads up as to what this might look like and what their employer role will be in this. There are, again, within the funding proposals that are being developed currently, there is a difference between the way that we deliver ACP to our, normal, perhaps university frameworks, to the fact that with an apprenticeship you've got to have more workplace supervision, etc. So we have tried to take that into account in the discussions.
I think certainly absolutely agree with Pat about early employer engagement, because there does seem to be sort of with everyone, this is all completely new in relation to advanced clinical practitioner apprenticeship. So it's kind of learning on by many people in relation to what does this mean. But also in my discussions with local employers, there is only one pot that they can draw from for apprenticeships, and therefore they need to prioritise what and who they're going to develop from that funding pot. And we haven't had a national fee set yet for apprenticeships. It's hard to speculate how high that could be. There are certain bandings from that. It could be 9,000, it could be 12,000. We don't really know. But that obviously is going to be a factor in terms of using the pot. But also, in reality, we don't know if there will continue to be Health Education England funding. Many of us have had students, or many students, coming through that funding stream. We don't know if that will continue. So I think in terms of the numbers and volume, while early discussions with employers might suggest that there might be quite a few that they want to send, you know, the reality of how many it actually means, like, I don't know, and maybe we'll need to bed down over a couple of years. You know, with the first programmes potentially starting September 2018, it may be a bit like we've had with the nurse associate and with the registered nurse apprenticeship, where actually numbers haven't really materialised until later on from that. So, you know, it will be a learning and hopefully a sharing of all our own experiences and how we're finding that happen.
So then,
You've done that already, yeah.
So the next question is, will the apprentice receive their final award from the HI who does the EPA, or the one who delivered the on-programme learning? Yeah, the Master's Award that will be given to the student will be the university's award. And that will include whatever the 20 credits that have been been attributed to the EPA. So the final Master's Award is given by the university. There is a separate apprenticeship. The EPA part, 20 credits attributed to the EPA, decides the grade, or decides the class. The grade awarded to the apprenticeship. So, for example, an apprentice could get, say, a merit. Let's say, for example, a merit for their apprenticeship, but could have done really well on the whole masters and got a distinction. So they could have a distinction in masters and a merit in their apprenticeship, or they could have a distinction in their apprenticeship and a pass in their masters. So, what I suppose in summary, the 20 credits in the EPA obviously go forward into the total masters classification, but it has its own separate grading, which is the grade for the apprenticeship. So the apprentice gets their degree, master's degree awarded by the university, and the apprenticeship awarded. So they get two things as a result of undertaking this. And they may have the same grade, or they may be different.
Yes, that's right. And just to follow that up, there's also specific grading criteria written for the endpoint assessment, which are not, so you're not using your own university, for example, level 7 generic grading for your endpoint assessment. But obviously in writing the endpoint assessment grading, we've had to be very mindful of the characteristics of a master's level assessment and the different levels that might be associated with a pass, merit and distinction. So it is, again, separate marking criteria. We've got one here. Will the HEI receive payment if the student steps off or leaves prior to completion? That kind of picks up on the point Pat mentioned a little bit earlier, which is that the apprenticeship levy is drawn down monthly. So if a student steps off, then the money will have been drawn up until that point. And therefore, it's not like the HEI draws down for a year, and then if the student drops off month 2, the apprenticeship levy has been spent for that year. So in some sense, it kind of follows the student in terms of what they do. Another one's the name of the award. Is there a plan for profession differentials, as in brackets, in the apprenticeship, or would this be determined in the HEI award, for example, ACP critical care? This is something that we have to discussed again within the group and try to seek clarity. The actual formal title of the award that's been put into the Advanced Clinical Practitioner Apprenticeship Standard is MSc Advanced Clinical Practice. No, it's practice. We have sought clarification in relation to the use of brackets, because some people will have, just as you've illustrated, an Advanced Clinical Practitioner brackets critical care, or indeed brackets apprenticeship. And we consider that it's up to the university to determine the title of the award, and the key aspect being MSc Advanced Clinical Practice, and then demonstrating the achievement of the apprenticeship standard. So that's the current aspect at the moment, current thought at the moment.
I think we've done them.
Yeah.
So yes, well, we've worked through all of the questions that have been sent in, and I'd like to thank Pat and Katrina for a really interesting presentation and discussion this afternoon. We will be making the recording of this webinar available via our website and through our bulletin. So if you do wish to tune back into this again, you'd be more than welcome to. But just leaves me now to say thank you to Pat and Katrina for coming here today, and we'll be signing off. So thank you.
Thank you.